Okay, so we've managed to go from a white towel to brown sofa, and now blue bed sheet. I guess this sort of thing happens when you move around too much and you end up selling things and yeah, whatever. Point is, we're here to do another unboxing finally. Specifically, this game right here. This is it's a huge box for the 7th guest, but funny thing is that it doesn't really need to be this big. You'll see in a second. Because we open it up here. I'm sorry for knocking the camera. Still go over there. So, very basic stuff inside here. Besides, I figured we haven't done an unboxing in a while. I got all this stuff here, so... First we got the manual here, which... Basic manual type stuff. Tells you how to play, how to install, all that fun stuff. And then this is a very interesting inclusion, because it's actually sort of like backstory and background on the game and the character who's like... This is really fun stuff here, because it's presented as sort of clippings and everything, too. And there's the characters that come into play in the game. Yeah, this is a fun thing to have here, and it really gives you an idea of the backstory if you're into that kind of thing. Wow. This is... What? Okay. This is a really thick troubleshooting guide. Wow. It's not even stapled or anything. It's just loose. Yeah, it's just coming apart. Okay, I gotta keep that nice and together. Oh, right, because this is patched up already. So this is just patch notes. Well, yeah, there's one of those weird sound cards that this thing supports. Help and tips, which... Okay, sorry about that. Kind of sucks living near train tracks sometimes. But anyways, helps and tips thing, which is just... I think this is just basically how to go onto their website and stuff. Or maybe it's more than that. Yeah, nothing much to that. Oh, registration cards. You will not be missed, now that everything's digital. Multimedia world. What does this have to even do with the 7th guest? Huh. Oh. And... What? Oh, it's... Of course, it's one of these things to, advertise the games that they had. Hey, Cannon Fodder, we're actually going to get to that one soon. Beneath a Steel Sky's been pretty heavily requested. Have the Carandia game as well. And then, of course, there's the actual disc. Which, I know it seems kind of weird, but take a look at this. This insert right here is huge. It doesn't even need to be that big because of how big the CD is. It really is just this... Okay then. It really is just a single one of these things with both discs inside. But it takes up so much... This thing takes up so much space. Like, the box doesn't need to be this thick. It's just... I don't know, they just wanted it really thick first so they could have a big thing on the side or something. I don't know. But anyways, let's actually play this thing.
it smells awful too. What's Stolf been doing here?
I remember nothing.
Well, we've got an odd one this time around. Today's Ancient DOS game is The Seventh Guest, and this is a very surreal game to say the least. It's also been requested a fair number of times, and I wasn't entirely certain why until I learned more about it and actually played it. Turns out this was not only one of the first FMV games ever made for the home market, but it's also very atypical in terms of gameplay, since at first glance you'd think that this was an inventory-based adventure game of some kind. Except it's really not. It's actually more of a puzzle game. The only appropriate comparison you can make when comparing this thing to games like Myst or Gabriel Knight is the FMV aspect. This entire game is composed of digitized actors set atop the backdrop of a ray-traced, pre-rendered 3D world. The actors only show up in the cutscenes to give you fragments of the story as you find them, whereas the rest of the FMV is used to create bizarre effects or transition the player between different areas. When I first started playing this thing, I was a bit worried, as the overarching style of this game doesn't really appeal to me all too well. Then I was relieved a bit when I realized how interesting the puzzles were. But then as I got closer to the end, the quality of the puzzles started to diminish. Basically, the game has a strong start but a weak finish, and save for 3 of the 22 puzzles in this game, I never felt like the thing was presenting me with an unfair challenge. And for the most part, I was actually enjoying this thing. Those 3 exceptions, though, we'll talk about them towards the end of the video.
You'll need more than lenses to focus your thoughts on this one.
The Seventh Guest was developed by Trilobyte and published through Virgin Interactive in 1993. Although most people would call this an adventure game, you really don't do a whole lot of adventuring in this thing, so it's more apt to call it a one-player FMV/puzzle game, which, let's be honest, is quite a unique combination in its own right. It supports both MCGA 320x200 and SVGA 640x480 256 color graphics, and also supports a slew of audio devices. Sound Blaster is the easiest to set up, of course, but if you can get it working with a wavetable device like MT32 or MIDI support, that would probably give you an even better audio experience. It also supports a couple unusual cards, including the AdLib Gold and something called the Aria, which, as far as I can tell, was a fairly advanced but relatively unknown series of audio cards which are extremely rare nowadays. As for its current release date, the game's still commercial, and you have a few options for getting this game. The simplest approach is to get it on GOG for $6 at www.gog.com, which also allows you to pick up the game's sequel, The 11th Hour, for a discounted price when you get the two together. Another option is to go on Steam, where the game's also available for a similar price. The game's incredibly finicky with graphical glitches galore though, so one option you have, if you want to avoid that kind of nonsense, get a ton of extra features in the process, and have an Android-based device, is to go onto the Google Play Store, as there's a brand new remastered edition available for just under $6, which includes the game's novelization and tons of other bonus content, as well as the ability to play with either upscaled graphics or the original graphics. As for obtaining a physical copy for sake of collecting, this is probably one of the easiest games to obtain, thanks to its original popularity and large production run. Fully boxed copies only tend to run about $6 to $10, which is often the going price for loose copies of old games, whereas if all you want is a loose copy, you can get one for dirt cheap. Getting physical copies running on modern systems can be a hassle though, and we'll definitely get into that later, so despite how cheap loose copies are, if you just want to play the game, I'd say spend slightly more and get a digital download that'll work immediately without having to finagle with DOSBox settings and disk imaging and such.
He was a drifter, moving from town to town, robbing a gas station here, the grocery store there until one night.
The story for this game is somewhat unusual, although it starts innocently enough. The game revolves around an individual known as Henry Stoff, who was once an unimportant, homeless individual who stole little things here and there to keep himself going. One particular night, he had a dream, and in it, a vision, which inspired him to make a toy doll. He sold the doll to a bar owner in exchange for food and shelter, and during that night, he had yet another vision in his dreams, with yet another toy to create, this time a puzzle, and when he went to sell it, everyone wanted one. Stoff's rapid rise in popularity allowed him to open a toy shop selling only his own one-of-a-kind handcrafted toys. Once unknown and unimportant, he had become extremely well-known and extremely wealthy. It's at this point that the story starts to be less straightforward and a lot more ambiguous. After quite some time has passed, kids were starting to get sick with a deadly virus of unknown origin. The only connection was that each kid getting sick had a Stoff toy of some sort, but given the popularities of his toys, this wasn't too terribly unusual. Stoff's final vision was to build a mansion meant to frighten and terrify, within which he had secluded himself, never to be heard from again, until one day, 6 people were invited to stay the night in the mansion, the promise being that only one of them would leave with their every wish fulfilled. But that to qualify, they would need to solve not only his puzzles, but also solve the puzzle of the 7th guest who had yet to arrive. Now, the game does some incredibly unusual things over the course of it as far as story and presentation are concerned. The character you play as seems to be able to transport throughout the house by focusing on various things a person shouldn't normally be able to fit into. Plus, virtually all of the FMV parts with digitized actors are shown in a sort of translucent way instead of solidly. There is a reason for all of this, but I feel I'd be spoiling a bit too much if I explained it, so I'm not going to. Just trust me when I say that these things make sense and are intentional once you understand at least most of what's going on.
Oh, this isn't real. Oh no!
The gameplay between puzzles is actually incredibly straightforward. All you do is click on the places you want to go and the things you want to examine. It really isn't any more complicated than that. The cursor can take some getting used to, though. It shows up as a skeletal hand waving back and forth to let you know that you can't click on what you're pointing at. It also gestures to indicate turning to one side or moving towards things. Highlighting certain things can also change the cursor into one of 4 different looks: a brain, chattering teeth, a mask, or an eyeball. The brain symbol is used to indicate that there's a puzzle you can solve, or that what you're clicking on is related to a puzzle. The chattering teeth are used to trigger events which are not critical to the story and often teleport you around the house. The mask symbol is used to indicate a story element you can watch, and quite often you need to both solve puzzles and trigger story elements to be allowed to interact with more of the house. Lastly, the eyeball symbol is only used in puzzles to indicate what objects you want to interact with. That is actually one gripe I have with this game, is that when you start out, the vast majority of things are locked, but not in any sort of visual way or method that tells the player that there's something to do. Instead, when you're done exploring and realize you've tried everything, you start backtracking and find out that something you couldn't do before is now doable. But again, there was never an indication that this would be something to unlock down the road. So a surprisingly large amount of this game is spent looking through areas you've already looked through, just trying to see if something new has shown up. Now, you do have a map screen, which shows you which rooms you have access to and which rooms you've solved puzzles in. But this doesn't help in terms of finding story sequences, many of which you must watch to be allowed access to other parts of the house. And part of the reason for all of this is because there's no inventory system, so the developers needed to limit progression in some manner in order to control what parts of the story you get and when. That way you couldn't just jump right to the end. Fortunately, the house isn't super massive, so when you do start having to backtrack, it doesn't take forever to rescan everything to figure out what things are newly clickable. As for the puzzles themselves, they cross almost the entire gamut, as they pretty much all come down to logic puzzles or word puzzles. Oddly enough, there isn't a single math puzzle in the entire game, although a couple of them are a little easier provided you can count. If you do come across a puzzle you're having difficulty with, you can get a little bit more direction from a book found in the observatory, which is one of the rooms you have access to right from the start. This book gives you some kind of direction that teleports you back to the last puzzle you attempted without finishing. Now, most of the puzzles aren't actually all that bad, and some are pretty clever. The cake puzzle at the start of the game is one of the two where being able to count helps, as you need to split the cake evenly amongst all 6 guests, but each piece must also have the same amount of decorations as well. The puzzles rapidly get much more difficult though. Early in, you have a chess puzzle where you must place 8 queens on a chessboard, and none of them can be in a position where they could take another queen. This is amazingly tricky to figure out, since you can get to 7 queens with a variety of patterns, but to get to 8 queens is far more challenging. Now, amazingly, what I came up with is not considered the de facto solution to this puzzle, and there is actually a much simpler solution which I discovered later. But it helps to prove the point that many of these puzzles do have multiple solutions, and the game is well aware of this. Some puzzles may be a bit too tricky though, especially a couple of the word puzzles. The one with the cans I really struggled with, as you have to make a sentence out of them with no vowels save for the letter Y. Now, this is one of those 3 puzzles I mentioned before, which I feel is unfair because even for me, with my rather voluminous vocabulary, I ultimately couldn't come up with enough words which worked with this thing and had to resort to a walkthrough. The one with the letter blocks I also struggled with, but it's actually really simple once you know what you're supposed to do. The trouble was, I thought I had to arrange the letters to make 3-letter words in all directions. Kind of like if you were doing this on the Scrabble board. But after a while, I put all the letters down on paper, along with every possible 3-letter word, and worked out that accomplishing this task was impossible. I then had to take a hint from a walkthrough to realize that this was pretty much the only puzzle in the entire game where you need to have been paying attention to the story, and specifically to the names of the guests, to actually solve it. That said, some puzzles are just way too easy and kind of play themselves. The bathroom puzzle with the chess knights is extremely easy, just boring and time consuming, whereas the last 2 puzzles in the entire game are extremely hard to mess up, as the knives puzzle has multiple solutions and is hard to mess up in the first place, while the skyscraper puzzle is extremely tricky until you figure out what's going on, and then it's a piece of cake. Now, I should point out that these are the exceptions. The majority of the puzzles actually do work well enough once you figure out the rules and everything. Some of them are also uniquely clever. For instance, the blood flow puzzle is going to seem impossible at first, until you realize that the best way to solve it is to go backwards from the end to the starting point. The puzzle with the bishops is also incredibly challenging, but never feels unfair and is bound to keep you tied up for a bit and is very satisfying to finally finish. However, there are 2 puzzles in this game which are just downright evil. The pit puzzle and the music puzzle. The pit puzzle has various colored tiles, a start point and an end point. The only goal you're given is to get to the end, which seems really easy at first, but then you get there and it's like, nope, didn't solve the puzzle. This is the only other puzzle I couldn't figure out on my own because the instructions for it are way too vague, thus again making it an unfair challenge, especially since even after reading a walkthrough and solving this thing, I'm still not exactly sure what the rules were and why I was allowed to move on. The absolute worst offender though is the music puzzle. And it's extremely simple really, all it comes down to is a simple game of follow the leader, so there's not even any logic involved, this is just memorization. But wow, they really messed this one up. First of all, seeing that it's nothing more than memorization, you'd expect the sequence to end roughly around the spot most people can remember sequences to, about 8 or 10 notes. The sequence you're expected to memorize is 18 notes long. If that didn't make it boring and difficult enough, the game's background music keeps playing while you're trying to do this, which screws with your ability to track the notes in your head since you have to pay attention to what's being played while at the same time trying to extremely hard to ignore that background music. The second worst problem with this puzzle is that it's glitchy under DOSBox, more so than any other puzzle in this game. I mean, just watch and listen and see for yourself. By the way, it's even worse when you're actually playing, as DOSBox's internal recording functions are more accurate than what you're actually experiencing. And yeah, that's only the second worst problem with this puzzle. The worst problem comes into play once you get up to the 12th note in the sequence, which is a high C at the right edge of the keyboard, and it's the last fully rendered natural note that you can click on. The problem is that you exit out of puzzles you're having trouble with by clicking on the extreme right or left edges of the screen. So when you bring the mouse cursor over to click on the high C, it's incredibly easy to accidentally click the symbol to cancel out the puzzle entirely. And if this happens when you're right near the end of this annoyingly long sequence and you have to go through the entire process all over again, yeah, so many reasons why this puzzle is just downright sadistic. Well, one last thing to note about the gameplay is that once you beat the game, Save Slot 0 will have a mysterious addition to it called Open House, which is a special game mode which allows you to roam the house and play any of the puzzles you want to. Although, since none of the puzzles have any randomness to them, there's not really much of a reason to solve them more than once. So yeah, the game really doesn't have much of a replay value as a result of that.
Oh, I'm dying to see what you'll do next.
Overall, the Seventh Guest is incredibly unusual, but an interesting experience all the same despite some of its hiccups. The graphical glitches are annoying for sure, but given the boundaries this game was pushing technically, it's somewhat forgivable. Heck, by the time they reached the final parts of the game, they'd run out of space on the main game disc, and instead of cutting down on material, they just stuck what little they still needed to do onto a second disc, making it one of the first multi-CD games ever released. The story isn't really anything special, and the acting is cheesy B-movie quality stuff, but again, this thing was so unique for the time that these things were excusable. There's no replay value, but you're still likely to get a few hours of gameplay out of this thing. So if you enjoy logic puzzles and word puzzles, then this is definitely a game to try out. Presuming you can get it working. Okay, let's talk about trying to get this thing working. Firstly, I tried a range of DOSBox settings to try and override the graphical and audio issues, but nothing helped. And from what I understand, some of these issues were even present on real hardware. So I ultimately just gave up on that. The most basic settings to use are to set cycles to max and to turn off the Sound Blaster mixer interface. The reason you need to do that is because the game automatically cuts the volume of sound effects down substantially, to the point where music and CD audio just blares over top. And it does this by overriding the mixer settings. The best solution is to disable the mixer interface, then set your own mixer level for the sound effects. I was using a level of 50, though you can go higher or lower depending on what you would prefer. However, this is the least of your worries. The game comes on 2 discs, so normally I would recommend creating image files of the CDs and mounting those in DOSBox. However, unlike a lot of early CD-ROM games, these discs do not image very well, suggesting they may have rudimentary copy protection in place, which is very rare for early CD-ROM games since there wasn't really public equipment to do this with, and even the equipment which did exist was extremely expensive. Mounting the CDs themselves seems to be the best way to go for playing in DOSBox, but you may run into issues when you switch discs and it attempts to play CD audio for the title sequence at the start of the game or the credits at the end. The other option is to try and get rips of the CD audio tracks, then use ScumVM instead, following the instructions posted on the ScumVM website for setting up the ripped audio to work within the game. This process is even more complicated, and ScumVM doesn't perfectly emulate the game either. So I guess what it comes down to is picking your poison. I imagine if you play the remastered version now available for Android devices, you won't run into any of this nonsense. So just something to keep in mind if you don't actually own the game yet and are thinking of getting it following this video. Anywho, that's all for this episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next Saturday for episode 168, we're going to be taking a look at a racing game. But unlike most racing games where you're in a car on the road, this one has you flying through the air. And if you think you know which game that could be, then be sure to send your guess to adg@pixelships.com and stay tuned to see how well they made this concept work.